and thank you for joining us here at the Aspen Institute's brand new headquarters, which is a lovely spot, even on a rainy day. Before we launch into our public event, I actually wanted to stop and ask everyone to please take a moment of silence for the students and the community in Florida. Thank you. My name is Danielle Gonzalez, and I have the pleasure of leading the policy work for the Aspen Institute's Education and Society program. I'm especially excited to join today in partnership with the Council of Chief State School Officers and America's Promise to revisit Leading for Equity, a report that we released with CCSSO 1 year ago in February of 2017. More than that, I am excited by the level of commitment among states and chiefs to equity. Chiefs like Pedro Rivera from Pennsylvania, Kirsten Baszler from North Dakota, and Tony Smith from Illinois, who will be joining us today on our panel. In recognition of the work to lead for equity, we know that there is a lot more work to be done to achieve our aspirations for equality of opportunity in America. We have to all do better for our most disadvantaged students. As I stood in front of you last year, I described the process that we undertook to define equity, talking to many state education chiefs, legislators, state board members, teachers, school leaders, parents, researchers, and more. We worked together to develop a definition for equity that rings true today. But I think we also have to acknowledge that real equity is about more than achievement gaps and test scores, about more than resource allocation and graduation rates, about more than standing on boxes to see over a fence to watch a baseball game. Real equity is about providing learning environments where all students work that is relevant to identifying
to federal funds to create an equity specialist position at the state agency who is dedicated to supporting classroom teachers on equity issues. In Mississippi, under Superintendent Kerry Wright's leadership, the state is offering its with that, to the President and CEO of America's Promise Alliance to offer a few opening remarks.
Thanks, Carissa, and thank you to Aspen for their partnership and for hosting in this beautiful new space, which happens to be very close to my house, so it's also very convenient. I'll be very brief this morning. We're delighted to be part of this venture with CCSSO and with the Aspen Institute. From the outset, America's Promise has been about every child having real access to opportunity, to education. And every to us means every, like every single one of them. And that takes you to an equity agenda. As most of you know, that for the past decade, America's Promise has spearheaded with some key partners the Grad Nation campaign, which has taken our graduation rate from roughly 71% to roughly 84% in about a dozen years. That means an additional 3 million young people graduated from high school over that time. A pretty remarkable achievement. And a disproportionate amount of that gain was made among young people of color, low-income students. But if you look at where we are at 84%, a disproportionate amount of the gain that still remains has to be for kids of color, for low-income kids, for English language learners, for kids with special needs. So there is real work to be done, as Carissa suggests. But we think that in the example of what's happened with the Grad Nation campaign are the seeds of optimism. That's real progress. And before this campaign and before this increase, people thought that low graduation rates, especially for kids of color and low-income kids, were inevitable. They were unchangeable. This just actually was the way things are. And over the past decade, I think we've demonstrated that that is not the case. That with hard work, focused work, and persistence, you actually can change outcomes for kids. It takes this powerful combination of real public demand, public will, that creates pressure on leaders and support for leaders who do things that are courageous. And then it takes real leadership, as is being shown by the chiefs. That is the powerful, undeniable, and ultimately unstoppable combination that will lead to progress. Real public will matched with courageous leadership. We think this is the heart of what needs to happen, and we're delighted to be part of it. So with that, it is my super pleasure to move into the discussion, and that means introducing my spectacular colleague, Tanya Tucker, who's going to moderate this next thing, this next panel. Tanya, there she is. And there she is, wearing the same thing. That's awesome. So Tanya leads our strategic initiatives and partnerships work. She has spearheaded the Grad Nation campaign over the last decade, and as you will see, hear, and experience, the total wonderfulness that is Tanya Tucker.
That's good.
What would you like?
I'll go
Go
down
over?
that side, Anthony. Yeah.
You want me on this end?
One on this side and two on this side?
All right. I didn't want you to drop my colleague, so I wanted to wait until.
I wanted to make sure everybody, would be able to recognize you from the picture.
Right.
So good morning, everybody, and welcome. Thanks for being with us today. I am pleased to be able to moderate this discussion that will take a closer look on how one state is working with stakeholders at a community level to advance equity. So first, let me start by introducing the wonderful panelists that we have with us today. Pedro Rivera has served as Secretary of Education in Pennsylvania since 2015. He took on this role after having served as Superintendent of the School District of Lancaster, and he has spent his entire career helping students, having served as a classroom teacher, an assistant principal, a principal, a staff member with the Philadelphia Federation of Teachers, and the executive director for the School District of Philadelphia. Anthony Anderson is Deputy Superintendent of School Support and Accountability with the Pittsburgh Public Schools. He came to Pittsburgh from Duval County, Florida, where he was a regional superintendent for 16 middle schools. And in his current role, he oversees the Chief of School Performance, the Chief Academic Officer, and the Executive Director of the Program for Students with Exceptionalities. So a big job there. And Esther Bush is the president and CEO of the Urban League of Greater Pittsburgh, and she has established herself as a voice of reason, a coalition builder, and a force for positive change in the greater Pittsburgh community and throughout the country. She is nationally recognized as a strong and very vocal advocate for economic and social equality initiatives that benefit African Americans and thereby the whole community. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for being with us today. And so, as you heard from the welcome remarks, we're here today to really recognize the 1-year anniversary of publishing the Leading for Equity commitments. And before we get to a broader national landscape and learning what states are doing and what progress they've made, and will continue to do and work together to advance equity in this country, we really wanted to first stop and take a look at what does it really mean to advance equity in a state? What does that mean? What does it look like? And Secretary Rivera, you were integral in shaping these 10 leading commitments from the very beginning. And once they were published, he took these commitments back to his state and began real meaningful conversations with stakeholders on how can we work together to make progress for all students. And a couple of those stakeholders with us today. And in Pittsburgh, the community and the public school system are working together with the state to really focus on commitment number 8, which is a focus on teachers and leaders. So that's everything from professional learning for the superintendent and district leaders to strategies for diversifying the teacher workforce. So let's just jump right into a conversation with this great team from Pennsylvania. And Secretary, I'll start with you if I can. If you could take us back to the beginning and give us a little context of how you were involved in crafting these Leading for Equity. Could you then
Ultimately, as rural or frontier, as our partners east in Mississippi. We have some of the poorest school districts in the country and some of the wealthiest school districts in the country. And when you look at our performance metrics as they relate to the NAEP, we're amongst the top quartile in NAEP scores in the US. So folks would think, well, that's a pretty high performing state. But as you dig down deeper, we are amongst the worst in achievement gap. When you look at the investment we make per child in the Commonwealth, you'd see that we're amongst the highest per pupil allocation in the country. But when you dig deeper, you'll realize we have the greatest disparity between wealthy and poor districts, black and white districts. When we have school districts a mile outside of a large urban area that contributes $25,000 a kid. We have a school district in a rural community that just contributes a little over $10,000 per child. And those are the reasons, that's the story we want to tell to ensure we're engaging in a real equity conversation. Because we know we can't decouple the needs of communities from the success of schools. And we can't have a conversation with the same group of stakeholders that make us feel comfortable. And so as I end this, I think one of the greatest opportunities we've had through this work, and Esther and Anthony will share some of this with you, we provided avenues to bring individuals that never really had a voice in government and policy to the table. And we listened. And it was uncomfortable. We sweat, we squirmed in our seats, we wanted to make excuses, but we held back and realized they were sharing their reality, they were sharing their commitment to their community, but at the end of the day, they stepped up and wanted to be partners with us to improve the quality of education, and as we say, regardless of zip code. For every student in the Commonwealth, rich, poor, black, white, gender, regardless of what they bring, to the classroom, to the school, we wanted to create an environment in which we can better serve those kids. And so I'm excited to be here today.
Thank you so much. And so, Anthony, I want to turn to you. So it's one thing taking the national conversation, bringing it to the state, but then how did you make that have sense for Pittsburgh public schools, and what impact has this work had on Pittsburgh public schools?
To just respond to the earlier part about looking at equity across the board, in Pittsburgh Public Schools prior to me arriving, they already had an MOU where the state is involved with some of our community stakeholders that brought forward a complaint regarding the racial disparity within the city. So with that being said, the MOU led to the state monitoring what we were doing to make progress towards some of those stipulations that were put in that MOU. As we know, awareness is great, but it doesn't invoke change. Just because you know it doesn't mean you're going to do the work and have the will to make the change take place. So many of those components of that MOU, we've only put pretty much a dimple in it. But my superintendent coming in, Dr. Hamlet, has done a great job of pushing because he wants to make sure that we do what's right for all children. Because if we can't have a foundation that's set based on meeting the needs of all children, we'll never get to meeting the needs when we isolate race as one of the components we're dealing with. So some of the things we've been doing is making sure we have an aligned curriculum across the board so that everyone has equitable access to an aligned curriculum and equal access to that curriculum. We've also put some initiatives in place around our K-2 suspension moratorium, where now we have predominantly African-American students being suspended even at the K-2 level. We have a moratorium in place where for nonviolent offenses, if it's a nonviolent offense, students will not be suspended. We have to find other resources to build into that. And that comes not only from our superintendent, that comes from our board also. So to make sure that you have these things in place, it has to be a continuum from the teacher, the student, the parent, all the way up to the board. And our board was actively involved with that process also. So now that process is moving forward to close some of those gaps. But we know this is an epidemic across our nation and that we really have to be steadfast about what our conviction is of how we have to change this. And I would say that under the leadership of my superintendent, bringing back and looking at those commitments, we've established our own process of just making sure that we identify every aspect of what are we doing for children. Each and every week we have our leadership meeting that is at the forefront of what we talk about. We talk about our suspension rate. We talk about the achievement gap. We talk about teacher professional development. One of the things that was also in place is every staff member is required to take a Beyond Diversity course so that they are more in tune with what needs to take place. But again, I just want to go back to the fact that that is only on a level of awareness. We are now in the process of looking at what do we need to do for next steps and how do we get it down to where we see it in the classroom. Because we know at each level, there's a gatekeeper for equity. You can have district initiatives, but if your principals and your central office aren't on board, they're the gatekeeper and it stops there. So we have to get it all the way down to each level to make sure that we meet the needs of the children we serve.
So, Anthony, for both you and Esther, since you've been stakeholders in this work, and the Secretary mentioned, some uncomfortable moments as you've been doing this work and having these conversations. And I don't think you can have conversations around equity without uncomfortable moments. So if you are and there are no uncomfortable moments, probably doing it wrong.
Right, that's correct.
Just moderator opinion. But I wanted to ask both of you all if you can describe the conversations around the state, with the state over the past year or two around equity, and how has it changed? How has it evolved? Is it different than it's been before?
Yes. Yes, simply to answer your question. I love the work that I see that was just described that's happening in Pittsburgh Public Schools. But what's coming up for me is the fact that around the beginning of 2016, I received a telephone call around the fact that the state was putting together an equity and inclusion committee. And they wanted individuals from around the state to participate. And so they had pulled together people from the Urban League, from the NAACP, from the Pennsylvania Commission on Human Rights, a variety of other organizations, including the Department of Justice, as well, for looking at some of the issues that were coming up as a result of the recent presidential election. Some things were happening in our schools, and they were happening on a very in-your-face way. And so they were calling and saying, Esther, have you seen anything in the Pittsburgh area, et cetera, et cetera. To get to my point, I was invited to go out to, I won't name the district, the school districts, but there were two outlining school districts. Wasn't Pittsburgh Public Schools. It was not Pittsburgh Public Schools, but there were two outlining school districts, and a long story short, I was a part of a meeting where the superintendent of schools, the principal of a high school, the vice principal, and a group of African American parents, about 20 of them, showed up, and it was their first meeting with the superintendent. And what they were looking at were the things that were happening in that school where it was predominantly white students. And the superintendent and the teachers honestly did not know how to bring the community together because they had not met before. But because of the change in government, because there was a new president that was saying and doing things that some would classify as racist, I think most of us would use that term. It was interesting that we all came together, and it was the first meeting the superintendent had with the African American parents. And so I was in the room, and I found it amazing that they weren't talking about education. Typically, when I'm in the room, it's, okay, the black kids aren't getting this, the black kids aren't getting that. It was really around racial relations. And I was called in. It was a wonderful first meeting. And as a result of that, the Department of Justice was called in, and the Urban League, myself, and 3 or 4 of my staff people that deal with teenagers, we were called in and helped the Department of Justice implement the SPARK program. And the SPARK program is an opportunity for students to have, and teachers, and the faculty in general, to have an understanding of race relations. That would not have happened a year earlier. It definitely would not have happened. And I was really amazed and astonished, and I said, this stuff is working. No, I'm saying that very seriously, because the kids were perpetuating some things that their parents had shared. And I said, okay, we're getting the kids brought up to date about dealing with the issue of equity and how to filter this, but what are we going to do with some of those parents at home? So Pedro, your work isn't done yet. I appreciate where you've taken us. And I say that from having worked with the Pennsylvania Department of Education over at least 2 decades. This was a totally different approach, that outreach was there. And this Equity and Inclusion Committee still exists today, and we're doing a lot of work, but we really needed that. And so not only in the classroom with things that are happening with pipelines, but bringing in programs such as SPARK, I am underscoring that the community-based organizations need to be there, but also there are other very serious resources like the Pennsylvania Department of Human Relations, which has done a considerable amount of work in the Department of Justice to move us.
Great. Thanks so much, Esther. So there are 10 commitments, and certainly within each commitment, numerous strategies and activities states and districts could take on. So How have you all come together as stakeholders to even prioritize what to take on first? How did that happen?
I think it's a combination of first, sometimes addressing the issue of the day or crisis, and but most importantly, trying to be strategic around our equity commitments and creating a vision. The SORASA plan allowed us to establish and create a vision around, around school conditions and school performance for the next decade plus. I think just to kind of reiterate some of what Esther shared, that was, really important for us to focus on commitment number 4, go local. And what she didn't share, and I have to really credit her and the team, as a result of the conversations they had and the work that they engaged in, we created, and right on the front page of our website, we have the Equity and Inclusion Toolkit. We realized that we couldn't be everywhere, and not every community was prepared, to engage in some of the difficult conversations of equity. So we put forth a living document, which is why we meet often, because we update the document to provide schools and communities a resource through the toolkit to address, issues of gender bias, racial bias, socioeconomic, linguistic, LGBTQ issues, and it's all forward facing. And it's amazing how many new stakeholders and partners come out of the woodwork and share. They want to not only be part of the work, but they want to advocate on this issue of equity. And the group continues to grow in really meaningful and productive ways. Secondly, I think, full disclaimer, and I'll share this quickly. We knew that the system of education in Pennsylvania had to change. I mean, first, we had this real heavy reliance, of course, like many states on standardized tests, and as a result, the culture and climate of education really, started to suffer, throughout the Commonwealth. So when I had the opportunity and was fortunate enough to be tapped to be the secretary, we started engaging stakeholders right away, because we understood that by engaging local stakeholders in the creation of policy, whether they're educators, advocates, administrators, our lawmakers, we can transform just traditional policy work to policy movement. And so we started engaging stakeholders early on. And then with the adoption of ESSA, it allowed us to refocus our work in the creation of the plan. I think, to share the work that Anthony shared that's going on in Pittsburgh Public Schools is partly the result of our Superintendents Academy. So we created a Superintendents Academy. Now, over the course of the past 2 years, over 140 superintendents have come together. And when you think of those 140 superintendents, they're responsible for the education of over 300,000 students in the Commonwealth. And they come together and they engage in discussions with a focus on equity. So we started by creating the list of some of our superintendents that serve our neediest communities in terms of socioeconomics and ethnic diversity. Each one of those superintendents had to create a culminating activity, an action learning project, and they presented to their peers, and they committed to their peers to follow that commitment, that project through. Pittsburgh had, created a project that dealt specifically around the preparation of new and existing teachers through that lens of equity, which is what Anthony, quickly shared. And because of that work, they're one of our 3 pilot districts for school improvement that, will allow us to create our vision and the process for school improvement moving forward, going in and engaging in a real deep dive diagnostic first, and then creating a school improvement plan that's based on the needs of that school district and the community it serves. So we're trying to think more holistically because of this work, how we support schools.
That's great. So you mentioned the Superintendents Academy, and Anthony, I wanted to turn to you. What impact has that had on Pittsburgh Public Schools and certainly your leadership and your involvement in the academy?
Actually, just I'm the little brother, so I don't get to go to the big boy school. I'm just a, I'm just a deputy. So, you know, but no, that's a major responsibility I have. But what I like to say is our superintendent comes back and communicates immediately with what changes need to take place. So around that, and I do want to reiterate the equity toolbox that has been on the state's website. We do use those resources. They're valuable resources, and we do a crosswalk because we have an equity department within our district with how we can use those resources to better prepare our teachers and better prepare our staff to have critical conversation and crucial conversation about equity. But as I said, our superintendent comes back and he immediately, we have Monday is meeting day, so Monday meeting day. And what we do is he has his executive cabinet meeting where he's always talking about some of the initiatives around school improvement. We had some initiatives in place around walks where we go through schools and in our most underrepresented schools where we don't get some of the achievement data that we would like. So we already have walks where we go through those schools, and the state provides ARLs, which are that assist us going through those walks, and they take stuff back to the state to assist us with the process of what our needs are and how we can better meet the needs of the children we serve. And with that being said, I would just want to commend the Superintendents Academy for making it. My mic's working. Okay. Check. But going back, our superintendent does a fantastic job of taking what he learns out of that academy. And it's not all about, and I want to say that we are a pilot, but I think we're more of a collaborative team. So it's not necessarily something we want to look at as a pilot, because sometimes pilots go away. We want to look at this as something that we are able to continue, we're able to work together, and I think that Superintendent Academy gives those superintendents time to talk about best practices. And some of the strategies that we're already using are actually in this plan, and we're working very closely with them to streamline this process so we can meet the needs of all schools across the Commonwealth.
That's great. So Esther, one question for you, and then I'll turn it to the audience for some questions. But so glad you were here as part of this team, because we know this work can't be done alone by schools and school systems, that it really needs engagement and partnership from the broader community. So can you tell me, how it has been for you and the Urban League to be at the table for these conversations? How have you shaped the conversation, or perhaps provided a perspective that otherwise wouldn't be there?
I think I am very pleased to be at the table. I think more civil rights and community-based organizations need to be at the table. We are progressing in Pennsylvania. I am one of those individuals where it is never enough, because when I look at the level of learning for the African American community and students who have English as a second language, and low-income learners, et cetera, low-income students, we need so much right now. And I am very pleased with the structure of ESSA has allowed us to work much more closely together and much more targeted in our approach to various things. I will say that over the last couple of years, our trust with each other has absolutely built. When we were going through the ESSA process, I had a problem, like several others did, with our in count. And I could pick up the telephone and talk to the deputy secretary with one of my other colleagues, and for us to share our concern. And actually, the dialogue went back and forth, and they said, well, Esther, we aren't going to change our in count. We know you're concerned about those 10,000 Black kids that you believe aren't going to be counted, but we will give that information to you and other advocates. And so it was something that wasn't originally coming from the state, but as a result of our relationship, our trust, our respect for each other, we were able to reach a consensus into how both sides could win. The same thing for with ESSA being concerned about, will parents be able to understand if that information really isn't coming out in a summative format where the parents can just see that my school has an A, B, C, or D, or a 75, what that means. And so, yes, we will be at the table having conversations around, we need to make sure that information is a little clearer. It's not written yet, so I still see an opportunity for input. And so I honestly feel like I am more of a partner, that my voice is being heard, that there is an understanding of where I'm coming from when we look at the statistics of the children's ability to learn in our state. And so I think it's healthy. And I believe I'm being listened to because they know I won't stop talking. So it's like, we discussed that last week, but I don't see it. Esther, we're getting to it, you know. Okay, and that's wonderful. And having experience with Pittsburgh Public Schools, things like courageous conversations and other things that are happening on the ground is really very, very helpful. And it allows us to see where our faculty is and where it can go. So, Pedro, we're doing well, but
Work to do. Absolutely.
we're a work in process.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So I'm not sure how we're doing on time, but I think we have time for some questions from the audience. And there are folks with mics. If you raise your hand, they'll put a mic in front of you.
Hi, I'm Terry Scheck. I'm going to point 5, follow the money, and allocate resources to achieve fiscal equity. And as you were describing, Pennsylvania is one of the least equitable systems in the country. I think it's the second worst. I mean, Illinois is beating you, but Pennsylvania is really hard-baked disparities and institutionalized racism in some ways in the funding formula.
Absolutely.
But Pittsburgh does better than Philly. I mean, how are the politics playing out? How do you find voice in that conversation, and trying to fix that?
So we're actually proud, but understand that there's still a lot more work to do. So one of the first policies we were able to engage in when we started 3 years ago under direction of our current governor, Governor Wolf, Pennsylvania, historically forever had no means of distributing basic education funds, which is why the inequities continue to exist. It was more politically driven and influence driven than it was formulaically driven. 3 years ago, we adopted, for the first time, the basic education funding formula, which allocates, and here's the catch, so this is where more work is needed. It only allocates new education funding. So of our current system, a little over $500 million is now allocated through the basic education funding formula. It takes into account poverty of the district. It takes into account concentrated poverty and dispersed poverty. It takes into account the number of English learners within the community, local tax effort, whether or not a community can contribute more, to the effort, and it's a good step in the right direction. The challenge is, first, we know through the recession and decisions that have been made in the past, we created a really big hole. And when you look at 10% reductions, which is what happened in Pennsylvania, 10% in your poorest communities where they receive a greater deal of state funding is much larger than 10% in a community where we were only contributing 2% towards their overall budget. So in our poorest communities, we created huge holes. And we are just now, after 3 years, $500 million, continued investment, we have still not yet filled that hole. And, we're getting there, but the challenges exist. So we've taken a big step in the right direction by instituting a formula and adopting that formula into law. why advocacy is important. A formula is only as good as what you put into it. And that's where I spend a lot of my time advocating on additional funding and resources for schools. And we've been fortunate, not fortunate enough to level the playing field yet.
Other questions? I've got some, so don't worry. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, Betsy Aarons. Especially in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, but really across the state, ESSA is looking at students of color having access to effective and highly effective teachers, and the disparity in brand new teachers in the highest need schools. Are you looking at policies and practices within the human capital environment that would really lend themselves to better equity for students of color?
Absolutely. We're looking at, very aggressively at the teacher pipeline and specifically diversifying the teacher pipeline. We're a little better than the national average, and yet still only 4% of our teachers are teachers of color, throughout the Commonwealth. So, first, part of our ESSA plan identifies incentivizing full-year residency programs as part of the four-year college model. We want to get teachers, prospective teachers, into schools for a full year working under a master teacher, and we have language that will qualify what that looks like. Secondly, we're working with Pittsburgh. They have an amazing academy, Brashear Academy, where students are completing 2 years of high school, 2 years at Allegheny Community College, 2 years at the University of Pittsburgh, coming out fully certified teachers and then guaranteed jobs in Pittsburgh public schools. So we've been supporting them through this model and making it a state model to incentivize Philadelphia and other geographic, school districts to look at similar models. And of course, we're supporting that locally, both with searching funding and changing our policies, to support that type of movement. And I think 80% of the students in the academy are students of color. Yeah. And so it's also diversifying the pipeline. We looked at our career and technical education standards to make it much more attractive and amenable to creating education as a career pathway, as well as other smaller grants, Troops for Teachers, and engaging the colleges of ed to be much more aggressive around improving the pipeline. I shared the Superintendents Academy. Attracting, retaining qualified candidates is one of the components, and as well as what we call Pennsylvania Inspired Leadership, our Principals Academy. We have a significant focus on how to better coach and support teachers. Lastly, and I'll just share this because this is really important for us in the Commonwealth. We realize historically state departments of education make certain assumptions. One, they think they're smarter than everybody else, and create policies without engaging the field. Our approach that we've noticed over the course of the past 3 years, we didn't make those assumptions. We assumed that the practical implications and the practical implementation of policy is probably more important than policy itself. And so by engaging teachers and principals and superintendents in the creation of state policy, they know they have a voice, they know they're valued, and our policy, the best we can, because we still have to navigate, the political structure, but the policy can better reflect what they need in their classrooms. And, through our Teachers of the Year, we have a Pennsylvania Teacher of the Year Council, and they meet with us as well as other stakeholders to inform policy. And we've already started to see a positive movement in terms of value and how what we're doing impacts the classroom.
Just on a local level, just to follow up with that, and I'm glad he did mention Brashear, we are trying to expand that program to make sure we make it more attractive and do a better job of marketing the program and put some incentives on the back end for students going through that commit to coming back to Pittsburgh and being a part of Pittsburgh. And so in talking about the equity aspect of it, when we look at knowing that many times diverse classrooms, students benefit more from diverse classrooms, but they also benefit from having teachers of color in front of them also. That's all students, not just students of color. So that research has shown that. So we're going out trying to ramp up our HR department's recruitment efforts. We're going out to many of our HBCUs, trying to recruit teachers to come to the area. And we're also looking at ways to market Pittsburgh a little better out into the to the local universities that we have. I think we have 5 universities in the city alone and they have educational programs. So I'm involved with conversation now with many of the professors from those programs to try to figure out how we can funnel some of those students, and not just of color, but mainly of color, into our system.
So let me close out our discussion with a final question, if you can answer with, I don't know, a word, a short sentence. But so how do you keep this going? How do you sustain this wonderful stakeholder engagement that you've got going now? What's it going to take to keep that going?
You engage partners like Esther. She'll pick up the phone and call me and call me out if I don't continue. And you know what? That's the beauty of the vulnerability of engaging partners.
Esther? I know I stumped you with one word, one sentence. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and it's, quite honestly, it's continuing the dialogue, continuing to, every time we talk, it builds trust, whether we agree or disagree. I know I have an ear, whether I think I'm being heard or not. I know they heard it. And so it's good. Just staying at the table.
Great. Anthony?
And from a school level, transparency. We have to be transparent, and we have to go out and let parents know we do want them to be involved. And I want to say that our superintendent did a great job of look, listen, and learn tour before we even developed our strategic plan. We had about 3,500 participants in that throughout our community, especially with our students, our parents, teachers, everyone involved. So you have to have all stakeholders at the table and be very transparent about what you're trying to do and how you're trying to benefit the students you serve.
Thank you. So please join me in thanking this great team from Pennsylvania. I'll speak for all of us that we look forward to continuing to hear the progress that you're making to advance equity for all students in Pennsylvania. So thank you very much. And I have the pleasure of transitioning us to our next panel that's going to give you a national perspective on this work. And so I'm pleased to introduce Darrell Burnett II. He joined Education Week in 2015 as a state policy reporter. He previously served as the bureau chief of Chalkbeat, Tennessee, a startup organization based out of Memphis. He's worked as an education reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, and the Louisville Courier-Journal. Please join me in welcoming Darrell Burnett.
Ooh, thank you.
All right.
Sure.
Thank you, Tanya, for that introduction. And thank you for inviting me for this really insightful panel. Today, our panel is going to be featuring a national perspective. Where have we been and where are we going from here? As a state education reporter for Education Week, I think about state policy every day. What's new, what's different, and how will it impact students? And I will be honest, there's a lot going on. An important issue we continue to discuss is educational equity. What is that every conversation seems to go back to? Will this policy meet the demand of all students? Will it help advance academic outcomes for all children? We are in a moment in this country today where state leaders and advocates in the civil rights education communities are taking a serious look at where we are and where we're headed. Equity in education has always been issues that states and districts and communities have struggled with. But today, it's as important as ever because 5 out of 10 students in public schools are students of color. In addition to that, Congress has reauthorized a key educational law, the Every Student Succeeds Act, that focused on meeting the demands of students in poverty and students have been traditionally underserved. ESSA has ushered in a new opportunity for policymakers and advocates to have deeper conversations about equity and how to create a more equitable education system. We just heard a great panel discussion on one state that's looking at this issue of equity and working together to advance their commitment to all students. Now we want to take a broader look at the landscape across the country. It's been a year since CCSSO and Aspen Education and Society program published Leading for Equity. How have states made progress against these commitments? What challenges have they faced? And let's talk about the hard work that remains to actually achieve educational equity. With that, I would like to introduce our panelists. Tony Smith, the Superintendent of Education in Illinois. Kirsten Baszler, the Superintendent of Public Instruction in North Dakota. Lillian Lowry, Vice President of P12 Policy and Practice, the Education Trust. Elizabeth Olson, Senior Policy Associate for the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. Gerard Robinson, Executive Director for the Center of Advancing Opportunity. All right. All right, so I'm going to ask all of our panelists, thanks for being here. I'm going to ask them all, name one success in the last year and one challenge in the last year in advancing equity. We'll start with you, Tony.
Thank you for having me. I will also say I'm still pretty full from yesterday's tragedy, so I'm probably a little emotional today. But the feeling for me about the celebration a year later and this notion of recognizing anniversaries is really important. But I wanted to also remind people that we're also celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Kerner report. So the Kerner report is particularly relevant in Illinois because Otto Kerner was the 33rd governor of Illinois. And to me, the opportunity to have conversations that are about transformation of social relationship to create greater opportunity infrastructure, we have to remember this has been a long conversation. So we're a year in this moment, but I just wanted, I actually have it with me, because there's something that I just want to remind people. This is a government document produced in this country, 1968, next month was published. Despite these complexities, certain fundamental matters are clear. Of these, the most fundamental is the racial attitude and behavior of white Americans toward black Americans. Race prejudice has shaped our history decisively in the past. It now threatens to do so again. White racism is essentially responsible for the explosive mixture which has been accumulating in our cities since the end of World War II. They go on to describe, up to and including, pretty radical notions of individualized learning using technology, computers and TVs. This is 1968, right? It's awesome to be a year in to an equity report, 10 commitments. This is a country that has institutionalized racism, and how we lead and talk about it really matters. I find this to be exciting. We've named it collectively as state chiefs. It's a shared action. That's powerful. But we need to recognize that this is not a new conversation and, wow, we got a new report. There's a long history of work and progress. And so I celebrate the fact that we're having this conversation still. But I will remind folks much older than I and more experienced, the transition from the Great Society to the rule of law 50 years ago, here we are again. And so how and in what ways we think about our actions today will matter for the next 50 years.
So I want to thank CCSSO and Aspen Institute and the American Progress for having this conversation. It's a very important conversation for us to continually have. And I think it's a great day to celebrate that a year ago we came together as state chiefs collectively as a nation to have this conversation and make these commitments. The journey for me began a long time ago. And the culminating moment was really when I attended the Aspen Institute conversation 2 summers ago. Actually, it'll be 3 summers ago now, and was invited to participate in that conversation about equity. And I was honored and thrilled that they included the state of North Dakota. It's not your first go-to state when you think about a conversation about equity. And I think that's why it's so important for us to have this conversation today, to understand that, often when we think about inequity and injustices, we do think about our urban and our East Coast and West Coast a bit more than we think about rural North Dakota, an isolated state that happens to be a flyover. But it really is a recognition for me. That's an issue that's been important to me for a long time. I'm a lifelong resident of North Dakota, and I see it and I experience it every day from my friends, my colleagues, my peers. And so to celebrate today the fact that we as a nation recognize that inequity and injustice occurs in every zip code in every state in our nation. And so thank you for including North Dakota in that conversation. The success that I think that we have could celebrate for North Dakota is the fact that when I came back from that Aspen Institute, each participant, and some of you attended, and some of you in this room attended that week, we were asked to make commitments as individual participants. And I made the commitment, the very first commitment actually became number 2 on our list. Start from within. Start with the SEA. And I knew that as a state education chief that I needed to institutionalize, create infrastructure and embracing at the SEA level. And so I started from within, and I really needed to have those conversations that regardless if you're an academic support person in my office, or you're working in title programs, or if you are simply a grant administrator, that each and every one of our employees and our team members needed to understand how important equity was, and it needed to become a mainframe of what the work that we do, every office in that state education agency. I needed it to last long after I left this office. I needed it to become the culture of our state education agency. And so we began intentionally working on that together as an SEA. We're working with the Midwest and Plains Equity Assistance Center out of the University of Indiana. We've had seminars and workshops so we can learn as an agency to talk honestly and openly about race and gender and disability biases that go on, so that when we can do that in our SEA, that we can better support our programs and better support our schools as they have those tough conversations within their schools and communities. So that's the celebration that I would bring. The challenge that I would bring is to our first priority on the 10 commitments, or our first commitment, and that is to really have our state and our other educational stakeholders and our state leaders understand that equity matters for everyone, every sector. And that just because when you elevate and provide equity, that doesn't mean you de-escalate and de-elevate other sectors. And to have them understand that. So there is a threat that certain people, certain organizations, certain communities feel when you start to talk about equity. So that continues to be the challenge, that when we all do better, we all do better. And really to embrace that as a state. So that's the challenge that still lies before me.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. I think we didn't turn my mic back on. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Aspen and CCSSO, for, again, inviting me to the discussion. I joined the Education Trust, which is headed by John King, who was the United States Secretary sitting in the seat when ESSA was approved. And one of the reasons that John asked me to join the team was based on our collective state perspectives. We were nervous, and I've been very honest about this. Where would the guardrails be? Who would be the keepers to ensure that when we talk about equity for all students, that it was top of mind for everyone? And we all remember the back and forth about disaggregating data and how funds were going to be distributed in ways that were equitable and supported these students who were historically underserved. So the success in the Ed Trust world is that all the states, the majority of the states, those who are far and few between, have kept student learning top of mind. So when we look at indicators that are going to be determining the effectiveness of state priorities, student learning is at the forefront. We are all about social emotional learning. We are all about social justice. We are paying attention to prison pipelines. But the most salient question we have to ask if our students are going to be citizens of the world and successful is, are they learning? So we applaud the states for doing that. So that is the celebration, yay. The challenge is, as they have really made sure that student learning is top of mind, when we start looking at how schools are going to be rated, we're looking at aggregated data. So we fought really hard to make sure that all groups were noticed, and we made sure that that was a part of the law, and we do have to report on them. But with the public accounting, when we report what is or isn't happening with the school, aggregated data, we all know, can hide the real story, and you heard Secretary Rivera talk about that very eloquently. So we could have a school that gets an A rating because in the aggregate, everyone is doing well, and then when we start disaggregating those data, the gaps are huge. And if those students aren't targeted in some way for additional learning, what priorities are we sending to the parent communities? That's equity. And so it becomes a matter of capacity, I think, and how we help people around capacity. But let's figure out how we build capacity with the state education agencies and districts and not have the number of schools that we can manage so that we can get through. So that's the challenge that we have to go forward as we rate schools and determine what kind of school improvement support each school will get.
Good morning, everyone. Happy to be here for this morning's conversation. So the NAACP, I think my mic is on, right? Yeah. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund has been working to build the capacity of grassroots advocates and other community stakeholders to engage in ESSA implementation. A big part of that work has been to work with community stakeholders, to work with their states, to ensure that they're incorporating effective strategies for reducing the use of exclusionary discipline practices and the disproportionate impact on students of color. One of our key recommendations is that states select school climate as an indicator of school quality or student success, and that they measure that by using discipline data and school climate surveys. So we've been working really closely with community stakeholders in about 13 states. And of those 13 states, I would say 3 have made significant progress toward that goal as outlined in their state ESSA plans. And I can get into more detail a little bit later about some of the promising provisions that we've seen in state plans. So the success is that some states are really thinking in an innovative way about their accountability systems and rethinking what indicators of school quality or student success might look like. The challenge is that more states are not as far along as we would like them to be toward that goal. So we hope that those states will look to other states that have been leading in this area to learn from them and to embrace some of the policies and practices that they're furthering. But that is one of our big challenges.
Gerard? So good morning. Good to be here in the new building. A year ago, I was at the American Enterprise Institute, a couple of blocks away from Aspen, and so it's good to be here as well. I'm also a Aspen Pahara Fellow, class of 412. We're the 412ers. So good to be here in that aspect. In a former life, was a member of CCSSO. So glad to be here as well. So a year ago, I was one of 45 people pulled together by Bellwether Education Partners and the Collective for Student Success to think about and to look at state plans in round 1 and round 2. So let me say at the outset, if I happen to mention a state, I will not confirm or deny that that is one of the states I had a chance to look at during that process. What I really enjoyed about the convening was the fact that you had 45 people who really were from different walks of life. We had people going back as far as the Reagan administration to people who had worked with Trump and everything in between. You had geographic diversity, racial, ethnic, even class. And we all didn't agree on the same thing. Imagine that. But what was great is the fact that we came together with one goal, was to say, how do we identify what quality is, and in this conversation, equity. So a year today, I'm still glad to be a part of the conversation. For me, I see the challenge and the success in the word equity. So I'd say on the promising side, we're going to have a very different conversation in 2018 than we had in 1968 with the Kerner report, for one simple reason. The majority of students in public school today are not white. Now that's going to change the dynamic of what equity means. And it's also going to change the dynamic of how we define who is the deserving and who's the undeserving. And so it will give us a chance to do so. The millennials have a really great opportunity to shape the next 50 years of how we think about it, because they've inherited a number of, I would say, skill sets and a template to make it work well. So the equity part, I think there's a lot we're going to learn. But there's also going to be the challenge in equity. One reason is when you say equity, it means one thing to a lawyer, and I'm married to one, so I love lawyers. It's going to mean something else to a state chief, a superintendent, and to a parent. And so we've got to find a way of actually articulating what we mean by equity. And I'm glad Tony mentioned the Kerner report, I guess, 50 years old now. Well, let's also go back to 1868, the passage of the 14th Amendment, and what role that's now playing even today when we're talking about equity. And so 18 is important, or I should say 8, in a lot of different ways, and equity one way or another will come up into it.
Well, all right, so I'm going to go to Tony and Kirsten here. Maybe you guys can describe the current conditions in this country that are making it possible to advance equity.
Certainly. So I think a few things are happening. You mentioned technology and personalized instruction, all of those. So that's the positive side of the national conversation, that with all of the flaws of No Child Left Behind, there were certainly some things that were very, very valuable about it. And I applaud the fact that it, for the first time, really forced us to uncover some students and some groups of students that weren't succeeding and weren't achieving as well as they needed to be. I'm pleased that that part has been retained in ESSA, but it really has forced us to use data in a way that is meaningful, and to really say, examine our instructional practices, examine our allocation of resources, and saying, are we doing this well? Are the right people getting the right amount of money and the right supports? And so I think the fact that we're in this technological age of the 21st century, that's an important piece of it, that there is a positive aspect. But also, I believe the conversation of immigration and equity, all of that national conversation has caused us as educators, I believe, to really step up and say, we need to change the conversation, we need to change the dialogue. It's our call to action. We cannot sit back and allow the conversation of equity not to occur in all areas of all sectors. And so this conversation was happening in North Dakota for quite some time. 10% of my student population are Native Americans. And when you don't have Native Americans, when you don't have 10% of your population functioning at their absolute fullest potential, that's going to impact your economy. It's going to impact your social programs. It's going to impact everything. And so we have that conversation openly and honestly at this point. I assimilate that to the national conversation. If we don't have 100% of our population fully functioning and operating at their fullest potential, we are not going to be able to continue to be the greatest nation in the world, or on that path to becoming the greatest nation in the world. So again, ESSA has retained some things that are very valuable and important, but it has kicked back a lot of the control to the local states, and in turn, local states, education agencies are kicking back down that control to local education agencies. And I think that's why it's so critically important that we have these 10 commitments as a group, that we are states leading for equity, and that we continue to have this conversation.
Yeah, I think the question that's come up a little bit is this notion of states' rights, and historically, the revulsion that can produce for some communities of color, and some other people think it was the best thing ever. And now, when we think about states' rights and states' power to lead, this question of what we're framing our support systems around, are we talking about full inclusion, deservingness of every child in every community? In Illinois, we're fortunate to change our funding system for the first time in 40 years. So now it's an evidence-based funding. There are 34 cost factors that have the highest effect size for all kids. That now, essentially, we have what's a common floor for the first time, and now we have a distribution system that recognizes the floor. We have districts, though, that are at 46% of capacity to provide that floor, all the way to 285% capacity. So now we have a common way to have a conversation about what's not happening and the lack of access. And we have this idea that we can talk deeply about what all kids need. And the thing that I think is more encouraging than pretty much anything else for me is brain science. So when we're looking at what's happening for individual learners and neuroscience, so culturally responsive teaching in the brain, Zaretta Hammond's work, really important, I think. The ability to talk deeply about every child is in fact unique and has an individual story, and they're part of a collective community story, right? So to know students well is to know them and what works for them, but it's also to know where they're situated, because we are all situated differently. And so I think we have a different opportunity to prepare the conditions for each child to in fact succeed. And when I started in the agency, we used the For Each and Every Child report from the Equity Commission to kind of come together. That was before we had this tool, So the conversation in the state agency is about opportunity infrastructure. We have 852 districts in Illinois. We're talking about creating 852 opportunity structures and have a lattice work of opportunity. So if we think about strengthening the country and that every one of our children and families deserve a quality education that will ensure civic and social well-being, that's how we strengthen the country. And I think every one of our kids deserves that. And in fact, that's the conversation that's happening. And now to have a guiding document like this for chiefs and to really take responsibility as education leaders for the well-being of our communities and states, that's what's exciting to me. And it's hard work. I mean, it's productive struggle. You got to be in it, you know, this whole keep your hand on the plow. It's rough, but you got to keep going. And I think that's the moment that we're in.
I think I would also like to add, as we talk about equity and talk about every student achieving their fullest potential, we tend to become very myopic in our thoughts about how we're going to measure that. We generally focus on reading, mathematics, English, science, and graduation rates, all very, very important measures. But I don't want us to, when we talk about equity, I think we also need to talk about not just academic success in those content areas, we also need to talk about civics. And I hope that we can inject more of the conversation about civics. That's truly how I believe we're going to change our country. If we don't have more equity in our decision makers and our leaders and the civic and more of our more diverse representation in our civic process, we're going to continue to go down this same path. I will share, something that we're not very proud of in North Dakota. Some of you may be familiar with the Dakota Access Pipeline protest that occurred. So that occurred about 15 minutes from where I grew up and about 45 minutes where I raised my own children. So it was very up close and personal. But I think that's a perfect example of saying, so you have a group of people where there were the hearings, the public service, the regulatory hearings, the opportunity for public input. And when we have a group of people that aren't comfortable with that, aren't engaged in that, and you can look at the research and the data, students of color and students who are living in poverty have much fewer exposures and experiences with engaging in that civic process early. They don't have role models and mentors that they see going off to the county commission meeting or the town council meeting. And so they don't know how to engage in that, and they certainly haven't been exposed to that frequently enough to become comfortable with it. So they get to the point of the only part of the civic process that they know and can do is to protest. And that's late in the game, and it is surrounded with discourse and strife. And so I think that's an important element that we're focusing on in North Dakota, and I think we need to, as a nation, that we ensure that our students in poverty and our students of color and our girls are more engaged and have more leadership roles. And when we can create that next generation of leaders with that understanding of cultural differences and who we are as North Dakotans, who we are as American citizens, we will have better policy that will lead to more equity in academic achievement.
Let's shift to our advocates. Give us a perspective from your lens. Where are we today when it comes to quality in public education? What progress are states making?
Great. So I'll just kind of, to pick up on the civics theme, begin with that. I remember being in the presence of my mother once, and someone made the statement, history repeats itself. And that sounded, I could not understand what that person was saying. And I said to my mother, what does that mean, history repeats itself? And she said, if we don't learn from our lessons, our experiences, the mistakes that we make today, we will make again tomorrow. And so just hearing the dynamics of this conversation, and I have been in education for a long time, and to Tony's point, we have been having this conversation for a long time. It is time for us to step up and do something. The good news about this conversation is even though we've been having the conversation for a long time, 50 state commissioners have come together to the point that Gerard made and defined what they think equity means. So there's some comparability from state to state, and not only have they defined and actually determined what action steps should be implemented to determine what success would look like around equity, they actually are bringing their communities in and educating them to what a definition of equity is, because what I fear is equity becomes a buzzword. And when we're talking to each other about equity, we're talking past each other. So kudos to the states for actually coming together as a unified force and saying, this is what we mean and this is how we will support each other. And I'll just take a few more minutes to brag on the Ed Trust staff when we start talking about what states have done and what we could do going better forward. John brought with him a new line of work called Resource Equity. He brought Area Americana from the department there to actually, she was working on the supplement. You remember that conversation when we were going through ESSER authorization? She was leading some of that work. So now she's at Trust leading a line of work called Resource Equity. She is partnering with Karen Hawley-Miles, who is at ERS, Education Resource Services, to actually look at those data around funding. And it shifts. We want to look at state funding formulas, as Secretary Rivera talked about, as Pedro talked about, but there's also something that happens once that money is appropriated to a district and how then that district appropriates money to schools. Because what we found is that those schools who are serving Black and brown kids and low-income kids are getting less money than the other districts in the schools. And that's just not about who the PTA is. There's something going on around appropriation. So we want to dig more deeply into that and give the field writ large some feedback on that. Ashley Griffin is our Director of Research, and she has written it through our I series, and this is all in the resources framework. And this gets to the point that was made around by Anthony from Pittsburgh. Teachers matter, and it's not just what is effective. I mean, if we take a suburban teacher from, I'll use this DMV area, from Fairfax County, which is where I live, who's been in an upper middle income environment school, and say that's an effective teacher because they're making great strides with their students, and put them into Washington, D.C. and Ward 8, different set of parents, different set of kids, different set of circumstances. I would bet you that that teacher would not be as effective in that environment as he or she was in Fairfax County. So we've got to define what effective means based on what kids need. And the research says that when minority students have minority teachers, their trajectory is immediately improved because those implicit biases that we do or do not know that are there, and those microaggressions that we do or do not recognize are not there. And so we've just launched a new paper on Latino teachers and just the struggles that they have within the environment. So when we can talk about struggles teachers have, being recognized, being heard, think about what's happening with our kids. And then the other piece that I will share is our policy folks, and it's really about the piece that we're discussing here today. Natasha is our policy director, and she wrote maybe a month ago, we shared it with CCSSO before we published it, Trends in State ESSA Plans, the pros and the cons, what things are happening good. It was centered around 3 questions. Are states keeping student learning top of mind? Yes, they are. The second was, how are we rating schools? And you've heard my belief about that. And the third was, how are we communicating to parents and communities where our priorities are in our kids? So that was an answer and a commercial for our Ed Trust staff to go online and get that research and read it. Is very informative.
So in terms of equitable school discipline, we have a long way to go in a lot of ways. According to the most recent civil rights data collection, Black K through 12 students are 3.8 times more likely to be suspended out of school than their white peers. And there's really no evidence to show that Black students are misbehaving more than white students. What research does show is that Black students are more likely to be disciplined for minor subjective offenses like disrespect, disobedient behavior, disrupting the class. So those numbers are really troubling because we know that students can't learn if they're not in school. That lost instructional time matters. But we do see some states that have made progress toward addressing that issue. So for example, California is planning on using or proposing to use, their plan hasn't been approved yet, the suspension rate indicator as an indicator of school quality or student success. Illinois, I know, is also using a school climate survey as an accountability indicator. So those are 2 things that we've recommended that all states really consider. And then there's other states who are continuing to make concrete steps toward incorporating indicators of school climate in their accountability system in the future. So, for example, New York is planning on using suspensions as an accountability indicator by the 2020-2021 school year. And they are convening a working group to really think through how they're going to incorporate that indicator in their accountability system, what that will look like. And there are other states that are also continuing to think through that. So it's really our hope that once those schools are identified, schools that are identified as having high rates of exclusionary discipline or high rates for certain student subgroups, that schools and districts really take that as an opportunity to work with community members to really think through how to address that issue. So some of the recommendations that we have is that they begin to think about utilizing professional development around implicit bias for school administrators and school staff, and also thinking about alternatives to exclusionary discipline. So restorative justice practices, positive behavioral interventions and supports, but making sure that there really is a good amount of professional development, technical assistance in place at the school and district level to make sure that those approaches are implemented with fidelity.
I've been enjoying listening to what everyone said. I forgot the question.
Oh, nice. Sorry. I'll repeat it. Give us the perspective from your lens. Where are we today when it comes to equity in public education? What progress are states making?
So we have more high school students today with a diploma than we did 1968. Mm-hmm. Major progress, particularly in what we used to call subgroups. Mm-hmm. So that's been great. We do see a diversity of the teaching force itself. Numbers may not be where we want it, depending on where you stand, but those numbers are going in the right direction. And I also think the school funding in a previous life, I was actually sued in my professional capacity in a school finance suit in Florida, which ended up winning, I think, a couple of years ago. The funding part, we know money matters. I say all the time, if someone tells you that money doesn't matter, tell them to give you their money. And we'll see if it matters. That's right. But while those things are moving in the right direction, the challenge I see is what happens when they arrive to college. The millions of dollars we're spending in remediation for students who we gave a diploma to, that we said are college and career ready.
That's right. That's right.
And they're going to college and having to spend 1, 3, maybe sometimes 4 semesters in non-credit bearing courses is a financial hit to families and students, and we know who's getting hit in particular. It's a slap in the face to all the taxpayers who voted people in the office under the banner of this diploma means something. And it's frankly just a shame that in 2018, we can allow someone to finish school with a literacy level better suited for 5th grade than for college, and allow them to go to college in the first place. So we have to have, and I see a friend of mine in the audience from Achieve. Achieve 21 years ago started this conversation with an executive from IBM. There's a lot they will tell you they did right and moving in the right direction, but they're also saying we still have more room to go. So when I look at the evidence, data matters, but I look at what's happening in college and who's dropping out by semester 3. They didn't become illiterate as a sophomore. That's right. We saw that challenge in middle school. We just called it, they're just misbehaving. It was cute then, but you're 21 years old, functionally illiterate. It's dangerous then.
If I could add to that, is in addition to what Gerardo said, I saw this data point that the top 10 jobs now, and I think it was in 2014, did not exist in 2004. So it's not only about the basic literacy skills, it's almost that coding, computer science has to become a third literacy because things are moving so fast. So not only are we graduating the students, we've got to say prepared for what? Even if we're raising the literacy rates, are we kind of thinking around corners of what's waiting? Because we don't know, we're preparing them for a future that's not yet determined.
And can we say equity is good and you don't go to college after high school? I say yes.
I mean, let's turn to the superintendents. A bunch of states have made college and career ready their indicator. I think both of you states that did. How are you guys going about defining what that means?
To your point, exactly, we've embraced that. We have what we call choice ready, and that is one of our accountability factors for our high schools. So that honesty gap is absolutely real. If we're graduating nearly 90% of our students in the state of North Dakota, yet 28% of them need to take at least some sort of remediation course, what did that diploma mean? That means they're not ready, and we shouldn't be giving them the diploma. And so to try to briefly explain where choice ready is, it's a part of our accountability pie, and the high schools get certain points towards growth, towards making sure that their graduation rate is matching their choice ready rate. So in our choice ready, you have to meet the criteria in either college ready, career ready, workforce ready, or military ready. We have many of our students, many of our citizens in North Dakota join the military. And so those are the three pathways. And if you are going to graduate a student, they must be choice ready, not just in one area, and we're not, just having them choose one, but at least two of the three. We'd love it if they met the criteria in all three of the areas, but they need to meet it in at least two of the three. And there are so there's three pathways, but at the top of that are non-negotiables. Absolutely, you can't even get out of the starting gate until you have met the criteria that will absolutely essentially ensure that you won't need to take a remediation course that first year of college. And so there are different pathways that we have a memorandum of understanding with the North Dakota University system that they have to meet certain criteria, but those are all in the starting gate level. And so all students need to meet that before they can go in and meet the other criteria. And so essentially what our accountability, that portion of our accountability formula is if a high school is graduating 100 students and only 50 of them are choice ready, that's their baseline. So we're collecting that baseline data this year. So next year, we'll collect that data again, and it's their growth model. And this isn't about students. This is an accountability factor for the high school. And so the next year, they better have 60 of their 100, and 75 of their 100, and 80 of their 100, until our graduation rate matches our choice-ready rate. So those are the things that we're doing in North Dakota, wholeheartedly embracing the fact that there is an honesty gap in this nation where we're graduating students saying that they're ready for life after high school, and they are not.
Absolutely. And opportunity for a shout out for Dave Schuler, who was named National Superintendent of the Year from District 214 last night. So the reason I shout Dave out is that he also was a lead proponent of redefining ready. And some of you may have seen that website and use a lot of that content. We've been fortunate in Illinois to have district superintendents from around the state convening, talking about this, the creation of pathways, community service. We also have a VEN for those being college and career ready, things you have to be engaged in that you must be able to check before you get to graduation. And we have a goal in Illinois that 90% of our kids will graduate college and career ready. And now working across all districts and looking at the opportunities and doing an analysis of what kind of opportunities kids have in different regions. So it's not just this goal that's really far and distant, it's looking at the regional opportunities that all the kids have. And so what kind of regional partnerships exist between community college? Are there MOUs? I will have to say, and if there are higher ed folks in the room, this might offend you, higher ed's still a real barrier because we talk about the ways in which we prepare young people and we have local agreements, but there's still some local decision making about, hey, it didn't matter if we have a student who got a 32 on the ACT, who could not get the right course put in, and so we wrote a letter. They were taking remedial coursework because of the decision so this opportunity and who this costs, I mean, this kind of question about the cost of higher ed and being ready, we need to have working agreements across higher ed, all of our communities, all of our kids need to be ready. If they can't get jobs, that's bad for all of us. So this question of are you college or career ready has to go away. Everybody, I mean, we have a goal in Illinois that 60% of our population will have a high quality post-secondary degree or credential by 2025. I mean, most states are going that direction, right? Some have higher. But we're working backwards from 2025. And just to say, if we graduate every kid today and they all went on to get high quality post-secondary credentials or jobs, we would still fall short of the goal of 60% of our population. We have to get people back who are already in, they're underemployed, they have jobs, but they can't make a living. We have to get people back in and pull families, community members back into education opportunities. There's so much to do in this. I think, yes, K-12 has a big role, but community colleges, higher ed, if we're going to talk about college and career ready, the workforce, we've been fortunate the Business Roundtable in Illinois has really stepped up. We used to use the work keys. Some of you are familiar with this. They basically said, not working for us. For exactly what Lillian said. Like, things have changed. Silver on the work keys doesn't get me what it used to. We need something different. And so what's the quality assessment that has people ready for work and ongoing learning? But yeah, it can't be one or the other. And I think we have said you can leave with a diploma that means nothing. And in particular, in communities of color, low-income communities, the most school-dependent families and kids, they leave with something they think matters. They go try to use it. They're stuck. They don't have anything else, and we haven't given them or prepared them well enough, right? Shame on us.
So I'm going to skip to the last question here because I think that was a necessary question. But so the first story I wrote about ESSA actually was about stakeholder engagement. It's one of the requirements under the law. And I'd like to talk to both the state chiefs and for the advocates because at the state level, I think what stakeholder engagement means has evolved. We heard from the last panel as to bringing people to the table. But now that the stakeholder engagement process is over with and creating the plan, what happens going forward? And then we'll talk to the advocates. How are you guys bolstering up what's happening at the local level? What role do you think stakeholders will play? So you can start with Tony.
Sure. So I think the opportunity we had was to go create relationships that had been non-existent, fractured, broken. So to say we would engage the community across Illinois, 100+ community meetings. We partnered with many different groups, advocacy organizations, and basically iterated. We kept writing the plan with community. We did 3 different drafts, gave it back out. And for all of the different work groups, we said, we're essentially starting this work. And we are going to work together. And the other powerful thing about every Student Succeeds Act is it can iterate. It's not like the old plan where you had to get waivers. The expectation is that it can be changed over time. And so these work groups are now still engaged and working. And up to and including at our last 2 board meetings, we've had the P2 indicator group came forward. The middle school group brought new recommendations. The technical advisory committee is still working on how to weight the growth. Like, we are still in dialogue and working with people so that as we implement, this is going to be a recursive process. That we came and extract information from you and then tell everybody that we had this great community engagement. It's actually iterative and ongoing, and that's what I think will transform the conditions, right? So this notion of just extracting community engagement as different than being in it, and that changing both, right, policy is intent, implementation, impact, and so keeping community through all 3 of those phases to keep changing what it is, in fact, the policy looks like over time is what we're about in Illinois.
In North Dakota, I'm going to talk about 2 different stakeholder engagements. So it was very explicit in ESSA that you must engage with your tribal stakeholders, and so that was laid out there in law as a requirement. I'm going to talk about that separately. What I want to talk about is how our ESSA plan came to be in the state of North Dakota. The state education agency, DPI is what we call it in North Dakota, decided not to be the writers of the plan, but to be the facilitators of the stakeholders that will write the plan. And so in early 2016, we identified all of our stakeholder groups. North Dakota is very unique in some things that not everything that is normally under the umbrella of the state education agency is under the umbrella in North Dakota. Our career and technical education is a complete separate agency with a complete separate board. So is our teacher licensing, our Center for Distance Ed, our technology. So that is all. So those are partners. Those are my partners, and it's very unique, and it's all about relationships and building trust. And so we brought those people together and said, okay, you need to be part of writing this plan. So we had representatives from each of those different agencies, as well as our North Dakota PTA had a representative, our gifted and talented, our special education community. We had superintendents and principals, elementary and middle and high school principals from small, medium, and large districts geographically out across the state. They were a tremendous team that committed with such intention to the work that we were doing. And so we met monthly, face-to-face, and broke up into subcommittee group works in between. Of course, you can imagine that many people, and the arts group were represented, and so there were many people that wanted to be on this team. Obviously, you could imagine everyone wanted a seat at the table, so we had to be selective about who was going to represent the middle school principals from small, medium, and large school districts. So when they were selected and appointed by me to be part of this committee, it was their obligation and their commitment to us that this wasn't going to be them sitting at the table, that they were going to go out and provide the information about what happened at the meetings, but then solicit from their unique stakeholder group what their desires were, what their wishes were. That's how we began every monthly meeting. And so we do truly believe Redefining Ready was a major contributor to how we developed Choice Ready, and that is because of that document and our superintendent's involvement in that. And so we feel that this is a state plan written by our North Dakota stakeholders, facilitated by the state education agency. So that's how we manage stakeholder engagement. When we understood that the writing of the plan was just the easy part, essentially. We went into this knowing that this is our plan as a state, and we were going to write the best plan that we could with the information that we had, but it needed to be ongoing, and the implementation is really where the rubber hits the road. So we have each of those subcommittees continues to meet monthly as implementation, as we hammer out the details. We use distance. Obviously, we do a lot of WebEx, where we record those WebEx and put it out on our website so people can view it later. We follow up with the question and answers. So every single educator in our state has access to that conversation that is going on in these implementation committees. We will reconvene face-to-face again this spring, the ESSA Writing Committee, and we will say, okay, how did this first year go? What's our baseline? What do we need to do? So that's how we've engaged the stakeholders for the writing of the plan. Specifically to the tribal stakeholder engagement, very important to us. I mean, as you might imagine, 10% of our students in North Dakota are Native American. And I learned a lesson. This was actually all going on during the DAPL protests as well. To have engagement doesn't mean you call a meeting at the Capitol and see if they can show up. I mean, it was very important to them. I have 5 different tribes, and I'm fortunate. Many other states have a much larger number of tribes, but I have 5 tribes in the state and 5 reservations. And so I intentionally went out and had this stakeholder engagement with not only the educators on that reservation in that tribe, but also the tribal councilmen and the tribal chairman and the tribal offices. And so we developed a very strong, close relationship, and it was about trust. They needed to really understand that this white woman showing up at their door was wanting to hear what they needed, and they felt very engaged, and we made some adjustments. Obviously, we had tribal representation on that large ESSA planning committee as well, but I'm just in the second, and that's not just once. I'm in the second round, actually. My scheduler and our Indian education director are in the process. I'm going back out to each one of those communities, to their tribes, to where their councils are, and have a touch point with them again to say, how is it going? And so that ongoing conversation and communication where they're being heard. We also, employed a lot of partnerships, both on the national level and the regional level, to help because there's a requirement in the law that the LEAs, if you had a certain percentage of your students that were Native Americans, they needed to have local consultations. And so, again, we needed to assist them in understanding that that's not a letter. That's not something that you put on your website. That's not a meeting at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and if whoever can make it, can make it. So we provided training, 3 or 4 trainings and follow-up trainings, and we will do that again, that trained our local education leaders on how to authentically do tribal consultation with the tribes in the manner that they needed to do it. We also are requiring, as part of our needs assessment, that in order for them to qualify in their consolidated app, that they too have ongoing consultation, that it's not a one and done. So that needs to be part of their consolidated app as evidence that they've had these ongoing and these touch points. And so that's how we've done consultation and stakeholder engagement in North Dakota.
We're running out of a little bit of time, but I did want to ask Lillian this question because you guys are doing some interesting work around your local communities.
Right. And it began with while the reauthorization of the Education Act was in process, The Education Trust went with 22 states around, we met regionally around the country with them, about 191 civil rights and other state advocacy groups, just to educate them on what is happening. This is the old law, let's juxtapose what they're proposing for the new law, and where you can be additive in working with your state commissioners and others to prioritize your local needs for your kids, local being state and or community level. From that grew, once it was reauthorized, we were really pleased because we had lots of voices, including the chiefs pushing for the disaggregated data and the ways that we could make sure that equity was top of mind for everyone. When the act was then reauthorized and we started writing the plans were approved, we chose, we're going to be between 6 or 10 states, but really deeply in 6 states, working with equity coalitions, those same people with whom we had worked during the reauthorization process, to do exactly what Tony says. How do we make sure that this process remains iterative? Because when people don't know, and I lived through the others, exactly what you put on paper is going to hold you kind of feet firm, no flexibility. Let me be a little more creative about what I actually say, with the idea that as we gain data year over year, we can make the appropriate changes. And so giving the kind of support that you heard from both Tony and Kirsten, and then especially from Pedro when he was here with his Pennsylvania team, that's what we're getting them to do. You cannot do this in isolation. If you're not working with your governor and your state legislature and your state commissioner, you're not going to get anything done. And I've been in that seat where they come and they're mad and they're angry and they're standing at that podium and it goes like, wah, 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 wah. But when you are advised and you are knowledgeable and you know what questions to ask and you do it in a way that you are being supportive and focused on kids, it makes a huge difference. And I would say probably our most salient partner in this work, and it started before Ed Trust, but we certainly have been engaged with Tennessee. I mean, every time we meet with Tennessee, you have someone from the governor's office. You've got the state commissioner herself and members of her team, all the civil rights and advocacy groups. That state is working so well together. It is just like a moving train, and that's through a Democratic governor, a Republican governor, and they're working on the person who's going to take over. So that's what we're trying to do, is stay focused on, are we keeping student learning top of mind? How are we rating these schools so we can identify those schools that need to have help? And then how do we communicate that to the public writ large so that they know where effective things are happening? But it also helps in the funding resource conversation. If we aren't transparent about what the challenges are, it's going to be really hard for us to make the case that we need for the additional capacity. So as you know, John King is huge in the social justice realm. And so we aren't just talking, as the two commissioners here have said, about academics. We're talking about the holistic approach. What's happening in these communities? So where are our mental health services? Where are social services? How are we braiding funds through all of these agencies, from local to federal, to ensure that we're getting the most and best results for our communities, with everybody working together and sharing resources. So excited about the work.
One of the things that's driving my coverage is just, what does local control mean? So I think that that's being redefined every single day in several different ways. We're going to take some audience questions. Does anybody have any questions?
Hi, Jim Cowan from the Collaborative for Student Success. First off, excellent panel. Congratulations to CCSSO for putting together the report and for getting this group together. I want to make sure I frame this correctly, because I feel like an idea brewing based on the comments that you were making. First off, Kirsten, I love the comments you made about the Choice Ready initiative, and I think that's really innovative and interesting. And I'm particularly fixated on the military aspect of this. Because it relates to something that Gerard said about the honesty gap. Well, you've both mentioned the honesty gap and not being prepared. And it goes to a study that Lillian, your organization, put out years ago, it's 2012 or maybe 11, around the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery. and the fact that 1 in 6 kids that graduate who want to serve in the United States military cannot do so because they can't pass the ASVAB. And that's essentially removing what has traditionally been a ticket to the middle class for a lot of kids who are coming from struggling backgrounds. And I see a relationship between that and what you're doing with Choice Ready. And I guess part of this is a proposal around the Honesty Gap Initiative to rekindle that study. Like, let's do a new one on the ASVAB to focus on that honesty gap about how we're reaching those kids who want to serve, who have that as a leg up into getting into more opportunities. That's one point. And then the other point is, for Kirsten, is are you getting any pushback in the state on these 3 buckets that you've created around choice, or is it creating more opportunities?
Great question. No, we're not. We're actually getting tremendous support. We have a larger than average per capita enlistment in either the National Guard or regular service. And particularly important, a large number of our Native American students are a significant part of our North Dakota National Guard and always have been and has served in many areas of the military. They're very proud of that. And it's part of the reason we added that as its own individual identity, because it's truly, there's a lot of pride of Native Americans wanting to serve the United States, and so we needed to recognize that and allow that as a pathway. There wasn't a lot of pushback about the 3 buckets. I think mainly because the starting gate, if you will, the 2 levels that you need to get through before are really focused on community service, the academic readiness for no remediation, the involvement that demonstrates time management. All of those, whether you call them the 4 C's or you call them essential skills or you call them life skills, those are the areas that are the starting gate, and then you go into the 3 different pathways, or if you will. But no, we didn't, because there's no pushback. But again, I think it's because the way that we developed it. It was the career readiness workforce. We had the chamber at the table. We had our business and industry. We had the Department of Commerce. We had our university people at that table. Really did, and then we had memorandums of understanding in place, or are in place, that this is the acceptance of what would be industry credential and the certification and what ready means. And so because we involved the stakeholders up front, and they went back and there was that discussion on the front end before we adopted it. So now it is ours, and that was intentional. We did not want to put something out and then sell it. We wanted them to own it, because then I have advocates all across the state from many different sectors, including education and business and industry, that are embracing this.
We're going to wrap up. We ran out of time. I'm sorry. Thanks again for everybody participating, and look forward to future discussions.
Thank you.
As we stated at the beginning of our time together, we came together today with the intent to celebrate 1 year of Leading for Equity, 1 year of all 50 state education chiefs committing to the same definition of equity, committing to specific actions that they're going to lead in their states, and that's pretty significant. We also acknowledge that we have a lot of work ahead of us. We have a lot of work across multiple measures. We talked about academics and achievement gaps. We talked about graduation rates and honesty gaps. We talked about college remediation and involvement in the democratic process. And we also talked about safe and welcoming learning environments and what we now know about how learning happens and the value of neuroscience. With all that in mind, I hope it serves as a call to action to all of you again watching online and here in the room today to further commit to leading for equity together, in partnership, and with our states who are leading together. Thank you again. If you would like to access the live stream, you can do so through our website, which is www.aspeninstitute.org/education. And then the report is available on CCSSO's website, www.ccsso.org/equity. Thank you again.